mentioned, right, identify as a youth advocate, specifically as an educator, as an ethnographer, who's ultimately dedicated to people's liberation.
Lamar.
Hey everyone. Yeah, Javier's energy it's great. Thank you. Over here it's actually 5:10. So, you know, I had a long day. I'm gonna try to keep it high energy like Javier, but you know, yes, keep in mind that it's 5 p.m. here. So, you know, like some of you already know, I live in Spain. I identify as an Afro-Panameñan woman. And something about myself, I'm a teacher. I don't think you mentioned that, Javier. And this is how I met Javier, actually. We met in a school we used to work at. And I usually, when people tell me my profession, I say that I am a maestra, like I'm a teacher, because I love my kids, and it's what what I was the happiest doing. Yeah.
Great. Thank y'all for those wonderful introductions. And quickly, right before I move into another question, I want to make sure that we know that this is is this a US-centric conversation? I think yes and no. Yes, we're having it in English. Yes, it's by the University of Texas at Austin. But I think the diversity and the experiences of our panelists are going to take this to another level, because we have Julissa, who is a part of AfroMexicanness, right? And that's a conversation that we usually don't have when we think about Blackness, even within Latinidad. And hopefully she'll talk about that a little bit more. And then Lamar has a complicated relationship with the United States, Panama, and now Spain. And she's in Spain. So I think her experiences, Julissa's experiences, will definitely help us broaden the conversation, that definitely will highlight some of the similarities in the experiences that we encounter. And because, like Lamar said, we met in an educational space. Julissa, I met her really in the educational space at the University of Texas. And I want to talk about a little bit about education. I think it's a good way to start, right? Because Julissa, you're finishing your PhD at Northwestern. Lamar is finishing a master's in Universidad de Politécnica de Valencia, right? And I know y'all been in schools in different countries, Panama, maybe Mexico, the United States. And can you talk to us a little bit, both of you all, about how you went about these decisions to pursue education in these different spaces? Maybe how your family or you made those decisions to move. Like, how do we contextualize this conversation? So Lamar, maybe you can jump it off.
Yeah, maybe we can go back and forth, Julissa and I, so it's not always alphabetical. You know, I have to jump right into the answer. Okay, yeah, so I went to high school in Panama City, and we, you know, I was thinking about the conversation, and we were talking a little bit about it, and at first, yeah, I told Javier I wasn't really gonna go into this whole you know, part of my history, but I guess it is relevant as we're talking about borders. And I went to high school in Panama, and for college, I went to New York to do college, because as an Afro-Panameñan woman, I'm an Afro-Antillean, which means that my ancestors come from the Antilles, the Jamaica specifically. And a lot of us, through our connection with the building of the Panama Canal, have connections, or ancestors have connections to the US. So it's not weird, it's not rare for you know, a Black Afro-Antillean Panamanian person to have connections, or a parent, or you know, an uncle in the US. So then I took advantage of the fact that my mother was living in the US, and I actually, growing up, I used to go back and forth between New York and Panama. And I decided to go there. And I think the decision to migrate to the US for school was one, you know, it was one that at the time, I did it because I wanted to have more access to resources. I was thinking about my own development and what I thought that meant at that time. And I think that it's a similar story to what, you know, a lot of the people that migrate for school do. You know, you're for, you know, a better future, and you're thinking about what are your prospects for a future in your home country, and then you know, you make sometimes a very difficult decision to go somewhere else. In my case, my mother was already there, and when she moved to the US, she was also, you know, she was also looking for that, right? I am something that some people call an anchor baby, which means that, you know, my mother, she had me in the, you know, back in the 80s, I'm older than I look. Back in the 80s, you could, I guess you could do that, right? So she had this child in the US, you know, in hopes to have, you know, papers. And she stayed, she's still there. She, you know, it worked out. And, you know, sort of, she's actually having some, but that's not the conversation. So yeah, my family, my sister is still there, and it's not a unique Lamar story. It's a very, or, you know, somewhat common Afro-Antillean story to, you know, to go to the US because you have a parent or a, you know, a family member that lives there in hopes for, you know, for a better future, you know, and access to things that you don't have access in your home country. Yeah. We were talking before about how, maybe this is for another question, but I'm just gonna say it. We were talking before about how, you know, it's very common if you look in Wikipedia or whatever you search for, you know, the history of the, you know, the Panamanian presidents, it's very common for them to have like an American, even like an Ivy League education. So, you know, when I moved to the US, I was in a way accessing, you know, the little bit of privilege that I had access to as an Afro-Antillean.
Cool. Were you done, Lamar? I wasn't sure if it like cut off or.
You never cut me off. Go.
Oh, okay, cool. So I think for me, that question, I don't know that I would frame it as choice. So I've only ever gone to school in the United States. So I never went to school in Mexico. Spanish is my first language, but, you know, my family's relationship to the United States began with my nana immigrating to the United States. So my nana, after her second child, married this white man. So thank you, white man, who helped us get citizenship to the United States. And basically he gave my nana citizenship or papers, and then my mom, and then my tío. And then after that, all of us were born in the United States. And so for the early years, right, like kindergarten through 5th grade, I was going to school in North County, San Diego, so in Oceanside. But when I was in 5th grade, my mom was in a relationship and he was deported. He served a year in prison, and then after that was deported to Tijuana. And, you know, my mom at the time was unemployed and didn't really have a way of, I guess, you know, providing for us. And at this point, my brothers were old enough that my brother 10 and 7 years older than me. So they decided to stay in Oceanside, but I was the youngest of the three. So ultimately my mom decided to continue in this relationship. And in that, right, I think like a lot of families who are separated by deportation, right, a choice is made whether to join that family member who's been deported. And I think for people who live along the borderlands, that decision can sometimes allow for that, right? Because you can live on one side of the border, but then commute to the other side of the border. So when I was 11, we moved to Tijuana. And that's when I began commuting. And years later, I figured out there was an actual word for that term. Apparently now it's known as like transnational students. At the time, it was just an identity that I knew, right? And it was a very common identity for those of us that grew up along the border. If you grew up in San Isidro, if you grew up in Calexico, like it's very common to have a good percentage of kids in your school who who live in Mexico and cross, you know, and I think it's very well known. Administrators know, teachers know, but it's one of those things where you kind of turn a blind eye and just, as long as nobody speaks about it, right, it's okay. But you know, what I did understand even at that age is that it was illegal, right? It is illegal to live in one place and live in one country and cross the United States. And it was also illegal on the front that, you know, years later, I learned that my mom was a permanent resident. And because of that, right, should be living in the United States, but economically, we just couldn't afford to live in San Diego. So I think choice is a strong word. I think when you're a child, I don't know that you have that decision-making power on where to go to school. But what I will say is that I don't know that it was ever a question of me going to school in Mexico. I don't know that that was ever a thought of my mom. I think in the world that my mom grew up in, right, like she understood opportunity to be equated to the United States. And she knew that if, you know, I was going to go to college, like it was the best decision for me to go to school in the United States. So yeah, that meant crossing the border, waking up early, and oftentimes my commutes were 2 to 3 hours, right? And that was oftentimes mitigated by the politics at the border. So after 9/11, you could imagine that the border waits were closer to 4 hours. So yeah, I don't know if that begins to answer my question as to my relationship to education, but yeah, me going to school in the United States and going to school in San Isidro in particular was essential to me being able to get accepted to Berkeley and to continue kind of my educational trajectory, because otherwise I would have had to pay international student fees, right, if I had lived in Mexico and tried to go to Berkeley. And as a first-gen low-income student, that wouldn't have happened.
I just want to say, one, thank you to Julissa and Lamar for being candid and sharing such deep and personal things with us here, because we, you know, migration stories, I think do invoke a lot of emotion, both domestically and internationally and transnationally. So thank you all for wanting to add those things about yourself, you know, because I don't want to say like entanglements, because I think, you know, we think about it differently after Jada Pinkett Smith, but I think, you know, we have a lot of entanglements with migration, right? It is messy, you know, and people move for different reasons, whether it's for, you know, family unification in search of different opportunities, or maybe sometimes just adventure, you know, and it does become complex as far as why do people, at what point do you like make this move? And it makes me think about nationality, citizenship. It makes me think about our identities and how do our identities, all the ones that we embody. And I'm a Black man with a father from Panama and a mother from Austin, Texas. So I think about this differently, about how does my racialized, gendered identity move when I go between places. And I know you both identify as Black or women of African descent. So my question to both of you all is, how do you navigate citizenship, nationality, race, gender, and all of the identities that you embody? And how do they move across borders? How do you navigate this border crossing, moving between these different countries, political contexts, languages, and different things? So that's my question, and maybe, I don't know, whoever wants it can go first.
I can go first. Julissa, did you want to go first this time?
No, como quieras, go ahead.
Well, yeah, gender, race, nationality, being an Afro-descendant Black woman, I know because I know it's not in general included in the narratives of national identity in the countries that I know of, right? All over Latin America, here in Spain, it's just not something that is promoted in general as like, this is what it means to be Panamanian, or this is what it means to be Spanish, or this is what it means, you know? So I think that oftentimes we have to find, you know, our own meanings, our own definitions, sort of our own national identity, like that's separate, that we have to create on our own, that's separate from the mainstream or what they put in the, you know, in the commercials for, you know, visit Panama or whatever. Because we're oftentimes not included, then we have our own meaning of Panamanian and, you know, our own traditions, dates, clothes, music. I think growing up in Panama, I always considered myself negra. Like there was no question, no ambiguity ever. I was just, you know, una niña negra or una adolescente negra. I was always negra. And then I started going to the US when I was in 5th grade. You know, I was born in the US, but I grew up in Panama, and I started going to the US regularly when I started in 5th grade to visit my mother for 2 months every year or something like that, right? So I think that I was, you know, by the time I started college in the US, I was somewhat familiar, you know, I knew, you know, how to handle things. But as I grew up and started working, you know, I remember specifically working in McDonald's and having, you know, a bunch of, you know, American friends that worked with me and hanging out and whatever. And I remember specifically, like, that was one of the first times that somebody was like, oh, you're Black and something else. And that this something else somehow means that you are like not Black, but, you know, somehow in the American context, like less Black. And I learned then, I figured that the local Black is always the Black. And I noticed that because when Black people from the United States go to Panama, it's the same. It's like, oh, you're Black, but you're from the US. And so, you know, being foreign Black, it's not like the local Black, because as we know, you know, being the local Black comes with a bunch of prejuicios, you know, and a bunch of ideas, and the way, you know, not only like lack of visibility, but also, you know, the ideas that, you know, the over-sexualization of Black women bodies, which, you know, we learned from a very early age from all the salsa songs that are like, you know, mi negra this and mi negra that, and, you know, whatever. And, you know, also the stigma of being impoverished.
Yes.
And all these things that, you know, as a foreign Black, you sometimes get to sort of cop out, or, you know, you're out sometimes. And coming here to Spain, it's the same story. The thing about being Black, and, you know, what I said before, being Black is not part of the national identity here. And in the organization that I'm part of here, it's clear that the Afro-Spanish people, you know, excuse me, somebody is saying something, but I can't read it. You know, it's not part of the national identity, and the fight is always to be considered as much of a citizen as, you know, the white ones, and, you know, sometimes like the mestizos in Panama, in Latin American countries. I think that as an Afro-Latina woman coming here, you know, occupying this space here in this organization and just being visible in different spaces, I learned also that the term Afro-Latino, Afro-Latina, Afro-Latinx, is not really a conversation that's being had in Spain at all. I went to this festival called Afroconciencia, and I had a shirt that says, you know, Afro-Latina, and people, you know, African people, or, you know, everyone would come and ask me like what that was, like what. It was very confusing because people, the majority of people that are in contact with never heard that word. So I was forced, I mean, not forced, but I gladly broke it down and explained what it was and so on and so forth. And, some of my friends have this conversation in the US as well as to what it is to be Afro-Latina, Afro-Latino, Afro-Latinx in the US. And even though this conversation, I think it's, it has been going on for a longer time in the US. It's still relatively new, and it's still a lot of people, arguing and discussing about this. Yeah, did I answer your question?
Your experiences are enough. You got answered. Cool. Julissa, thank you.
Cool. So I may have forgot the question entirely, but I feel like I have an answer for it.
Go ahead.
So I feel like my relationship, I think, to the border is one that is continuously evolving, for sure. And I think with that, right, my understandings of citizenship, as a kid, right, when I lived in Oceanside, right, to me, the border was home, right? Like, to me, border meant like a short drive and a barrier to get to my cousins, and then get to like the best snacks in the world. Like, to me, it was just mediated by like these beautiful childhood memories, right? Like, of going to what used to be my nana's house, and having to cross back and sit in that borderline, but it meant family, right? Like, my relationship was deeper than just this wall. And it wasn't really until I moved away to Berkeley that, Berkeley people try to be mad critical. So I'd be in class and, I'd share where I was from, and they're like, oh my God. They're like, San Isidro. They're like, how is it with the wall there and like the military industrial complex? And I'm like, yikes, like that is an interpretation of the border, right? But I think oftentimes people forget that like that is a version of the border, yes. But I think there's also people, there's also life, there's culture that is very like fluid between the two communities, right? So there's, what Anzaldúa kind of talks about, right? Like, it's a borderlands of not just mestizaje as the mixing of all these different races, but cultures and identities, and the continuously like grappling of what it means to like not be from here nor there, but to be from both. So for me, right, like the border invokes a sense of home. And I think sometimes people forget about that, and they allow like the rhetoric, particularly right now with this administration, right? Like, Trump's administration has erased the fact that there are people and communities in these places. So even to like invoke a calling of a wall is like a literal destruction of a people and a community that has thrived there long before this administration. And I think in terms of your question of like, how do I understand Blackness as it relates to like citizenship and nationality, I think for me, one realization that I have is that, certain bodies are policed more at the border, and certain genders are policed more at the border. And I wouldn't say I was among that policing, right? I think when we think about, right, forms of who is undocumented, right? Like the visuals that we pull on are brown skin individuals who might look more indigenous looking, right? So there was times where I would forget, like, I'm crossing the border every day. Sometimes I'm going to forget my passport. I'm going to forget my birth certificate. But not once did I think about turning back around and not going to school. Like, I knew that I could get across the border because I spoke English, and my Blackness in many ways served as a marker of my Americanness. Right. And so in a very different way than I think my peers, right, who were also attempting to cross the border, like there was times where I would be in line, and mind you, it's a whole community. So if you're in the borderline and you see somebody wearing uniform, because we used to wear like white collar shirts and like black bottoms, blue, it didn't even matter if you didn't know that kid, you could automatically go stand in line with them because we were all going to school. Right. So there's like a camaraderie. But there was definitely times where I saw kids that would be like, I can't find my passport. and they would like turn back around because they didn't even want to have to go through the policing of their body in that way. And that was not something that I ever really grappled with, right? Like realistically, if I was in line and I forgot my passport, I would try and find a Black person, a Black migra, probably a man, and I would go and say like, hey, I forgot my papers. And he'd be like, oh, where do you go to school? Ask me a couple questions. But ultimately me speaking English, and, you know, not speaking with a Mexican accent, if you will, right? Like allowed for me to get across, right? So in many ways, it was interesting to move away from the border and to understand that Blackness takes privilege and forms in different contexts, or like takes form in different contexts. But for me, my relationship to Blackness was oftentimes one of also great privilege, right? Like there wasn't a questioning of my Americanness. And I know that obviously that has since changed, right? Especially since the migration of Haitians to the borders, right? So I think if I were to go in this body and try and cross now without papers, I'm sure that would be put more into question. But when I was crossing before 2009, that wasn't the experience, right? So yeah, I don't know if that I tried to kind of touch on your key buckets there, but yeah.
Oh, that was amazing, both for you all, because I think these are conversations that we do not have, and like not many people think about the complexities of movement, you know, including for myself, Julissa, and I can be candid and share personally quickly. You know, my father, I thought the first time he came to the United States is when he came to Austin to go to college. But I was having a conversation with him recently, and I was like, when was your first time in Texas? And then he was like, well, you know, in 1971, we crossed the border. I'm like, wait, I thought you got off the plane at Robert Mueller Airport in 74. Where is this 71 coming from? And that was my first time learning that my dad unlawfully entered the country as soon as he finished high school and was deported back to Panama. I never knew that about him. And I was like, well, how did you do it? He was like, we walked across the border and people thought we were African Americans. They literally thought we were African Americans, and they didn't ask us any questions until we got on the bus and we were going to Dallas. I was like, where were you going? He was like, we're going to New York. I was like, how are you going to get to New York? He said, you know, we saw JFK get shot on the news in Dallas. So we knew if we got to Dallas, we could get a bus to New York. I was like, wow, right? What a story. But it blew my mind how he was able to navigate that space because of his body completely different than other bodies would, and how we think about it. So thank y'all for bringing those into the conversation. And I think gender is super important to this conversation. And when we had a conversation, Julissa and Lamar, and I would love for Julissa to jump it off, we talked about politics of hair, and like how you all have experiences with hair being read differently in skin tones and undertones. And Julissa, you talked about going to the Bay Area at Berkeley and having a very particular conversations with terms like light skin and red bone, and Lamar was like, that was. So I want for you to please, as we begin to open up to questions, is if you can talk to the politics of hair for yourself and the gender body that you're in. And Lamar, do the same thing. And Lamar, if you can hold it in, remember, because you mentioned like what happens after the conversation of hair politics as it relates to Black identity and issues within Latin America. So if you could touch on that as well. But Julissa, can you please jump us off on that piece?
Yeah, so I guess what I was sharing, right, is that so when I got to Berkeley, let me start there and then kind of reverse back. So when I moved to Berkeley, right, it was the first time I'm like living anywhere away from home. I'm like 9 hours from the border. And that was the first time in my life that someone called me light skin and red bone. Mind you, I didn't know what red bone meant. I'm like, huh, what? Like, what's red bone, right? Like, but like the shock of being called light skin was like, I had to kind of like unpack that, because that wasn't my lived reality growing up in a, in many ways, like really homogenous Mexican community, right? Like there's a couple of my friends on this call from high school, and they can vouch to the fact that our high school was probably 90% Mexican, right? So in my high school and where we lived in San Diego, I was one of the darkest skinned people around, right? And so I grew up with being called negra, and I grew up being called morena. Like my nickname was morena. And like even when people would catcall in Spanish, they would say like morena color de llanta, aquí está tu ring cromado. If you can understand that, but basically I was the catcall means morena color of attire. And that's like what my association and my skin tone was, right? Like I grew up knowing that, and my relationship to my hair was the same, right? So I grew up with my Mexican mom who is brown skin but has very long straight hair. My brothers have straight hair. I'm the only one in my family with curly hair. So we didn't, in my family and in the Mexican community that I lived in, right? Like nobody really had curly hair. So my mom was trying to figure out how to even take care of my hair, right? Like she had the most difficult time. So we would literally walk down the aisle at Walmart, and you know where there's like the black products, my mom would be like, choose one. Let's try a new one today. So I literally, do you guys remember Jam, that like purple? Okay, so I didn't know that was like for edges. So for years I walked around with just like greasy hair because we didn't really know how to take care of my hair, right? And so growing up, right, like the associations to my hair, like I remember people saying like my hair parece estropajo. Estropajo is like something you clean with, like a rag you clean with, or pelos de escoba, like from a broom. So it wasn't until I moved away that I was actually surrounded by more of a Black American community that I started hearing comments about my hair being good hair and being light skinned. And that to me was a complete reversal of an identity that like I didn't grow up with, right? Like and you know, we can speak to I guess the challenges of growing up. Like I love the community I grew up in, right? And but we are a very anti-Black community, right? And so to have, I mean, there's a very candid conversation we can have about anti-Blackness in the Mexican community and the Latinx community more broadly, right? So growing up in that, right, like you're constantly put into question watching novelas where all the protagonists, right, are like these light-skinned blonde women, and all the villains are like these dark-skinned morenas who are like vixens and you know, the Jezebel tropes, right? So I grew up with that, and so my relationship to hair was not one of having good hair, right? And like even the connotation of good hair didn't quite make sense to me. And so it took, right, me having conversations with other Black women with, you know, who identified as Black American or who perhaps were Caribbean Black, and like understanding where that was coming from. And with that, right, also understanding why sometimes relationships with other Black women were sometimes, you know, there was tension, and I couldn't understand that tension. And it took me unlearning and relearning, like, okay, these are the experiences within Black America, and why I might invoke a certain response. So yeah, I'll say that and then pass it off to Lamar, and then maybe we can bounce off from there.
Well, thank you, Julissa. That was great. Yeah, as far as hair, you know, growing up in Panama, hair, it's, you know, natural Afro hair. It's something, or we used to be something related to being a child. So sort of like as you know, every Black girl, as you turned maybe 12 or 13, 14, you had to perm it straight, because, you know, grown women don't have this kind of hair, right? It was you know, that was the sort of the unspoken narrative around natural hair then. And that slowly started changing, and now there's a movement around hair that focuses on you know, your right to wear your hair as it grows out of your head, and not having to change a part of your body in order to be accepted into a society and really survive, because, you know, oftentimes like, people like in job interviews, they would ask you to perm your hair. So, you know, it became also a matter of survival and a right, right? I can't eat if I don't change a part of myself, which is not right. So, you know, this whole movement started, and it was sort of it started happening in other countries at the same time. But I also think that this movement, I was telling Javier that I'm worried. No, I don't know. I think it's important that the movement addresses the bigger issues around Blackness that are very similar in the countries that I've lived in. That it's important for the conversation, you know, not to stay in hair. I think hair is very important, and I get very upset, you know, when some, you know, when people make it like, oh, but it's just hair. I don't think it's ever just hair. It's actually a part of my body, and like you wouldn't ask me to chop off my hand, you know, to get a job. That doesn't, it's not right. It's not just hair. It's a part of me, and I'm not going to change it because it's not me anymore. Especially if what I have to change it into, it's, you know, Eurocentric standards that have been oppressing me for the last 500 years. So like, it's not just hair, but I think it could be used in such a, you know, in a special way, sort of to open a broader conversation about, you know, what it means to be a Black woman in a lot of Latin American societies, in, you know, in the Panamanian society, and, you know, how the Black woman is perceived, how, you know, the particular, you know, issues that as Black women we have to deal with. You know, there was a study done by the BID, el Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo, the
World Development Bank. The World Development Bank.
Okay. And it talked about the, you know, the curious case of the Afro-Panameñan women, which is that, you know, in a percentage, it's much more educated, yet it doesn't, that doesn't translate into having you know, good paying jobs. So it's like the most educated of all, you know, in the research, yet it's like, it's not well paid. That doesn't translate into, you know, a better and a higher standard of life. So like, you know, having this conversation about hair, it's important for it to evolve also into all this other, you know, into all these other things that as Black women we have to deal with. Yeah.
Thank you both again for that great response. And I know because we only have an hour here, I definitely want to give the audience a chance to ask questions. So please, if you have a question, begin to think about what that is. And please, like, you don't have to like give us a lot of background to ask the question. We prefer like if you ask the question so we can answer it and have other voices heard as well. And I definitely want to highlight, I don't think we talked a lot about the work that Lamar and Julissa does, you know, working Julissa with incarcerated youth who are largely youth of color in the United States, and the activism that Lamar does on multiple levels in multiple nations are definitely things for us to highlight and what they do. But again, because we're only here for an hour, definitely want to add some voices from the audience. So if there's any questions, I think you're able to unmute yourself, or you can raise your hand and I will unmute you and we can ask questions. And remember, please, so we can make sure that everybody has a chance to say something. If there's any, if not, believe me, I have questions for these two wonderful women that I have written down. So I'm trying to give us a chance. So if there are any questions.
I have a quick question.
Okay.
Sorry, thank you.
Maria, I'm next. I see you, Maria.
Okay, thank you so much for your comments. And just to be brief, I would love to hear more about how your conceptualizations of these different places have influenced your work with, particularly, I think it's Julissa, with the carceral state and having to move and cross these, I'm a geography person, so moving across these spaces and the politics of these places impacts or intersects with your conceptualizations of this work that you do. And yeah, thank you so much. That's it.
That's a great question. Hopefully I'll write about it in my dissertation. But I guess one thing that comes to mind is, even though I study carcerality within the context of a juvenile detention center, I am always thinking about carcerality more broadly, right? And like I guess with that, forms of confinement that are broader than prisons and juvenile detention centers, right? It extends to immigration detention centers, which are very material forms of confinement. But also if we think about reservations, right, as forms and extensions of carcerality, if we think of borders as that, right, and like even the creation of like nation states as forms of confining people to geographic locations. So I think part of also how I bring my own experiences into the work, I think as an ethnographer specifically, I do see a lot of myself in the kids that I work with. I work with a lot of Black and Latino kids, and most of the Latino kids I do work with are Mexican American. But even the way, right, that they're forced to navigate as young people, the limitations of space, right? Like there aren't a lot of spaces in the Midwest, and I'll say in cold areas, right? In the off summer months, so we're thinking about cold, there's not a lot of spaces for young people to access, right? Like where do young people go, and where can young people gather, and where can they access, like, you know, just something that belongs to them? And so I think about it as those are forms of confinement, right? Like when we don't give young people space to experience freedom, like what are the decisions that they also make in that? So I don't know if that begins to answer your question, but I guess I feel like my study is more a study of a type of carcerality, but not the only type of carcerality, right? Like prisons are the most material form, but there are so many other forms. And hopefully in the future, I will get to do more work within the border region.
Thank you for that response. I have Mari for a question, and then Diane, I saw you with your hand raised. And so please go ahead, Mari, and Diane, you will be after Mari.
Thanks so much for your presence and everybody else's presence that's on this call. It means a lot just to see these faces occupying the spaces that we do. So can't say thank you enough. The question I have though is in terms of support. We often don't get asked that question of what do you need to support the work that you're doing. So I wanted to pose that to the both of you, if you would like to share ways that we can help support and elevate the work that you're doing.
Okay, thank you, Mariama, for that. When Javier was reading my bio, he mentioned that I was, which is not true. I am. I know I'm in Spain, but I am actually part of those organizations in Panama, because the internet is great. And I, me personally, if the people that are here can follow the accounts of the organization, especially the youth, La Red de Jóvenes, right now they have this really great campaign. It's called Un Kit para el Camino. And it's like a kit for the way, or for the road, a kit for the path, right? And they're giving in Panama, there's in the border with Panama and Colombia, it's a very hard border. And because of COVID, there's a lot of people that are stuck in the border. And even without COVID, it's a very complicated border because you have to cross the jungle for a bunch of days and people get robbed, raped. And they arrived in Panama, you know, needing a lot of basic stuff like shoes. So they're giving a kit for a kit, like a bunch of basic stuff to children that are in the border, and they're raising, you know, a very small amount of money. Actually, they're only raising like around $3,000 or something, and with that they can buy a lot of things actually. And they, you know, they haven't reached their goal yet. So if you know, or anyone here is interested in that campaign, Un Kit para el Camino, that, you know, that would be great. Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. Thank you for asking, Mariama.
Yeah, that was a dope question. I had to sit for a minute and like really think about my answer. But one immediate thing that came to mind, so before I started researching and like doing research on juvenile detention centers and the learning experiences of young people, I was an educator in prisons first and foremost, right? Like as an undergrad, I started off as a tutor with the Teach in Prison program at Berkeley. And then from there kind of started taking in different roles. And then I was a GED instructor. And it was during my time as a volunteer educator that I really started to develop these questions around learning. But one of the things I learned in being in that space is that oftentimes I was one of the only people of color in the prison setting that wasn't an incarcerated body. Typically, the people who dominate volunteering in prisons are white women, and then I would say white men, and then women of color. And that makes sense, right? I think particularly when I think about Black men and men of color and their reasons for perhaps not wanting to subjugate their body to being in a prison apparatus, when statistically, right, you're taught to fear that. So I understand why folks might feel like I don't want to be in those spaces, but honestly, I think it's one of the more transformational things, not just for yourself, but also for the kids, right? To see people that look and sound like them, and to be mentored, right? Like by people that look like them. And, you know, those relationships can make a difference. It's a very small thing, right? Like if you volunteer once a week, right? Like that can really, sometimes kids, and I'm focusing on kids, but I mean, the work needs to be done with adult men and women as well. But I feel like that is a small way of changing and like invoking change and being about the change, whether it's like tutoring or joining organizations like the Beat Within, or there's so many organizations that kind of do work like that lead like girl groups inside of the detention centers. So it would be beautiful, right, to see more Black and brown folks in there alongside these young people, learning with them, learning from them. So that comes to mind. And yeah, sometimes we don't have time. So if that's not a feasible ask, then there's organizations, for example, like Liberation Library and others like it, that are continuously taking donations to bring books into the detention centers. And what's really dope about that is that Liberation Library in particular allows the kids to keep the books. So kids can request 2 books per every 2-week session. And then when they leave, they get to take the books with them, right? And we know that sometimes in low-income homes, children do not have books they can readily access. So, you know, next time you're thinking of donating books or donating money, think about resources that we can give to those populations. Yeah, those 2 things come to mind.
Diane, go ahead. I think this might be our last question. I see a couple other hands going up. I think Diane might be the last question, and we'll address that. But go ahead, Diane.
Yeah, I hope it's not too big of a question to have an answer today, but if you don't have an answer, that's fine for me. So my thoughts have been really surrounding over migration, and especially with the increase, not the increase, but when we think of migration, we always think of, especially Latin America, we think of brown migration, right? Non-Black migration. And so, but we see the data saying that there are more Black people in the detention centers. And so kind of, I would like to, if you would permit, is like, can you talk about the experiences with your experiences with migration, and then the information literacy that is behind Black immigration? And so kind of like thinking of like your information behavior, like how did you get the information that you needed as Black individuals to cross borders? What did that look like for you guys?
I'm gonna try to answer your question according to what I think you're asking, and I hope with all my heart that I do it.
My question is also
well, as I was mentioning before, yeah, there are a lot of Black people in this border that I was telling, in the Panamanian border with Colombia. There's actually only Black people there, and you know, most of the people are coming from new routes that exist from Africa and Haiti. And then, we also found a couple of people from India. And I know that sounds crazy because most people are like, how, this is a new, I don't know. But yeah, and I think, that clearly there are differences between borders and, I guess in the US, and the way that a border would look like in, between Panama and Colombia. But I think, I think that more and more we are seeing that. I think that for my case in particular in the United States, because I'm American, that, it wasn't really an issue. I had issues of being out of state, but not for being like in paper foreign. I was read as being a foreign person when I started speaking. But if I didn't, I think people didn't read me as a foreign, and in paper, I'm not foreign. But here in Spain, I think one of the hardest things, it's like how to navigate those institutions that go, how to get a card for, like, in my case, for like a student card that, gets me access to be here for a year. And if I do it right, 2 years. But I didn't do it right because obviously this information is not available. It's not like, it's not, in pamphlets or like highlighted in places. You have to know somebody who did it the right way. And I didn't know anybody until after, so I just did it for 1 year, and I'm actually now in a little bit of a situation because of COVID. And but I think that for me, like, one of the most important things was to know other people that were trying to get the same kind of paper, like the same kind of visa that I was trying to get. And that was really the only way to get information that was useful, because the institutions and the offices that are in charge of helping you don't really care, because they're saturated and because they're racist. So for me, it's like knowing other people that are doing it too.
So I don't know that I entirely have an answer to your question, in part because similar to Lamar, like, I am a US citizen. So I think negotiating immigration as a US citizen, I don't know that that was ever a system I had to navigate realistically. But I will take this as an opportunity to say that, since I left San Isidro in 2009, which is when I moved away to college, right? Like the border has changed a lot. And I think we to some extent are aware of the changing narratives around the border, right? Like in 2018, because of the Haitians that kind of came to the border region. I'm talking specifically Tijuana and San Diego, right? So we saw after the earthquake in Haiti, right, like that, there was a mass disbursement of Haitians throughout, and a lot of them came to Mexico, right, because Mexico is a natural point of terrestrial entry to the United States. And so what I want to take an opportunity to speak to is kind of the rhetoric that I did witness, and how the rhetoric was changing even on behalf of Mexican outlets, and how they were describing Haitian, so first Haitians, and then right during the quote unquote caravan of Central Americans coming up into Tijuana, and then setting up like, there was like settlements, right? There's entire settlements throughout Tijuana of Central Americans, and even the backlash on the Central Americans that were coming was mainly on Hondureños, right? Like it was Hondurans because they're black bodies, right? You didn't, even like the images that the media was feeding us, it was oftentimes Hondurans and not Salvadorians and not Guatemalans, right? Even though everybody coming up was coming from distinct parts of Central America. And it was almost like those two rhetorics kind of merged together, right? Then it became like, Blackness at the border. And in a lot of what we saw, right, was a response to that. It was a response to, I think, again, I'll go back to like, you know, within Mexico, I think, I mean, there's a historical, we would have to go into like, I'm sure how we can do like a whole lesson on like the politics and like the history of anti-Blackness in Mexico and Central America, South America, right, and all the Americas. But like part of what we see, right, is like a very violent response to them being in Tijuana, right? And in many ways invoking the same rhetoric that Trump was invoking against Mexicans, right? And so it was like, we got to keep them out of our borders. And like, it was like their response was so violent, not just on behalf of the Mexican government, but also the cartels, right? The cartels were responding very violently. And there was so many incidences of like Hondurans being kidnapped, right? And so it became almost like this rhetoric of they're taking our resources, they're taking our jobs. You know, the Hondurans are coming in and taking all the like construction jobs. And so that was very disappointing to see, but to also some extent, it was also like, this is the anti-Blackness we've been talking about, right? Like the inability to recognize that it's so embedded in like, we can't even understand that they are doing the same thing that we're asking for Trump to allow us to do, to cross the border into the US. And now we're trying to push them out. And because we're framing it, there was a framing of, for example, the albergues, what's the word for albergue? Oh my God. Okay, so like at the border, right? There's when folks were being deported, there was like these like safe homes, maybe shelters. Yeah, maybe shelters. But basically, right, there's like these points of entrance along the border where almost like the YWCA was for undocumented folks who had been deported. A lot of those places were being reallocated to serve the needs of Central Americans and Haitians coming in. So then that became attention, right? Like they're taking this, they're taking that, right? So I'm kind of rambling at this point, but all that to say is that is an example of anti-Blackness along the border, because part of what they were responding to was not the actual, what they were responding to was and responding with the same rhetoric that we despise about Trump and his administration, right? Was the very same one that we as Mexicans were invoking. And I say we because, right, those were conversations that I needed to have with my family as well, right? Like they weren't taking those jobs. You weren't out there building buildings, like, you know what I mean? Like, so yeah, that's all I gotta say. Dan, I didn't answer your question. I just used it as an opportunity to tell another big story about anti-Blackness. So there you go.
But look,
that to me is fine. I really appreciated both of your Lamar and Julissa, like your answers, because like as a Hondureña, this is that was something that I was hearing, and I would get the backlash of it. There'd be like, oh, why are your people coming and taking everything? And I would just be like, what? But yeah, no, that's to me is like, to address immigration, first we have to address Black immigration, because then that would just benefit everybody.
Most definitely. Thank you for the question, Julissa and Lamar. You did an amazing job, Julissa. I was probably going to break my fingers trying to snap so hard underneath the table for that small piece that you did, because it's important for us to know. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Fortunately, we were blessed with the presence of these women to come put us on game. And I don't even know if I'm supposed to say that in academic setting, but whatever, game. You know what I mean? Like, that's how I interpret all these things. So thank you, Julissa and Lamar, for all the things that you've done. I mean, all the things you're doing in the small time you spent with us today. Everybody, as we close, because we're over time, we will post about literacy, Liberation Library on DDC Global. We will post about Un Kit para mi Camino on DDC Global on Instagram. I just put in our Twitter hashtags and all those things. So if you want to connect with Julissa or Lamar, please follow them on their Instagram or Twitter handles. Doing amazing work, and I promise this is only the beginning of what we're hearing from these two amazing women in the work that they're doing. So thank you all one more time for joining us today. Thank you to DDCE. Thank you, Dr. Devin Walker, for creating this space for us. Thank you for allowing us to think about ourselves beyond borders. Yes, and we hope to see you all soon again. I know people are asking for a part 2, maybe, but it's definitely a needed conversation. Thank you all for coming today. Really appreciate you all being here. Talk about it amongst your friends and remember all the things that we talked about. Big shout out to Julissa and Lamar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Javi, for your energy. It got us going.
No. Y'all have, no, that's on you all. I talk a lot. But nonetheless, have a good afternoon, everybody. We will see you all soon and be looking out for further information. Thank you, Miguel. Thank you, I appreciate it.
Gracias, Lamar.
Ciao, Julissa. Ciao, everyone.
Ciao, que te vi.
Bye.
I really have to log off, y'all. I'm late to another meeting, but I want to tell y'all a huge thank you. Like, y'all killed the game on some for real type stuff. Like, big time, hands down. I'm going to put myself in a comparative mode. I don't think there's any other department on this campus that's going to produce programming within a space around Latinidad like this, period. Fight me. And I'm serious on that. But I think it's what the necessary conversations that we need to be having in these spaces. So I love it. I got to go, y'all. I'm super late. And I have to go on Zoom as well. So I have to cut it off. But thank y'all. Thank you for coming by. I will follow up with y'all in some way. Dr. Walker will have to find some way to compensate these women in gratitude in some way. I don't know if y'all have Tiffany's cookies, Tiffany's treats over there, but they're good in Spain. In some way to say thank you. And I will, at least, if we don't have any way to do it. But thank y'all so much.
Bye.
Thank you, Wallace. Thank you very much. And thank you, Julissa. I've learned so much from you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I learned from you too. It was great to meet you. Hopefully one day in person next time you're in Austin.
I know. Soon.
Bye, y'all.
All right, ciao. Thank you, Devin, for everything. All right, thank y'all. Bye-bye.
Ciao.